Hi, so here at the beginning of our study of Asian philosophy, before we get into all the detail and rich diversity of thought that we're going to encounter in the Indian and Chinese traditions etc., that we're going to be studying, I thought it would be good at the beginning here to kind of get oriented, because I know that not all of you have had the opportunity to study philosophy before. For many of you, this is your first encounter with the academic discipline known as philosophy. And some of you, on the other hand, have already had introduction to philosophy classes and maybe experienced an introduction to the Greeks, Plato, Aristotle, and all the rest. Some of you have studied world religions and have already encountered Hinduism and Buddhism and all that in other contexts. So I know we're all gathering from many different places here in this space together. And I thought it would be good to kind of do a little housekeeping and make sure that we're aware at least as well as we can be in this introductory setting as to what the central understandings are of the discipline of philosophy as it's taught here in the West. So I'm in California here in the United States, and I know some of you are watching this video on YouTube from all over the world, and that brings new contexts and connections into the work. But focusing here on the Western perspective, we often start philosophy classes with the Greeks. Is that because the Greeks were the only ancient people who did philosophy? Obviously not. But it is a fact, nevertheless, that here in the Western tradition, we have inherited a way of doing philosophy that has deep roots in the classical world, that is ancient Rome and ancient Greece. It's in our language even. Look at the word philosophy. It comes from two Greek words, philo for love and sophia for wisdom. So philosophy literally means the love of wisdom, not the love of knowledge, by the way. And if you saw the previous video on the one about the distinctions between wisdom and knowledge, you know why I'm spotlighting that. Knowledge is information, it's facts, it's theories, it's the ability to accomplish things, to do things. But wisdom is a little more mysterious, as we saw last time. Wisdom is the art of living well. It's embodied as opposed to conceptual. And so love of wisdom, keep that in mind, because I know philosophy has kind of a bad rap in some circles as, abstract and intellectual, and a bunch of people arguing about the meanings of words, and you're not wrong. That's kind of that's sort of what happens in philosophy a lot. But here in our study of Asian philosophy, we're quickly going to leave that behind. And maybe just sitting with the meaning of the word philosophy will help us remember that. It's above all else, before we get into intellectual abstraction, it is about a yearning, a longing to understand how to be a human being. That's the philosophical impulse that is way beyond the Greek project. It is human. All people all over the world do philosophy in that sense of longing, yearning to understand how to be whole, how to belong in the cosmos, how to belong to one another, how to fit back in to the interconnectedness of all matter, all energy, and all consciousness. That, I suppose, is what wisdom looks like. Being one with everything, being free, and being in love with one's own life and everyone else too. So the love of wisdom is where philosophy begins. But we notice right away that different cultures develop different methodologies. As I mentioned before, the Greeks handed down to us in the Western tradition a set of methods and processes for getting that wisdom that is largely rooted in language, logic, and rational discourse. Plato, and particularly his student Aristotle, really rooted us in an almost scientific logical approach to the project, using words and being careful about the definitions of those words. That was the method, shorthanded as rational discourse, that is championed in the Western tradition, and it's hand in glove with the scientific tradition that grows out of that. But as we look around the world, we see other cultures, the indigenous Americans, the indigenous peoples of all continents, Africa, Oceanica, East Asia. Wherever you go, you see people in their primal cultures doing philosophy in their own way, sometimes using meditation, prayer, mystical insight, religious experience to gain more understanding. Sometimes you see them using art, poetry, chanting, ecstatic visions, dancing, and all of the above, right? These are all the methods that people, human beings, have used to close the gap between them and the object of their desire, namely wisdom. So there are lots of ways to be philosophical, and I'm arguing that it's an innate human characteristic. So as we get further into our Asian philosophy studies, though, we're going to see that there's a distinction between Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. It's right in the name of our class, right? Asian philosophy as opposed to Western philosophy. So we'll get to that in a moment. But first, let's just sketch briefly, again, from the Western perspective, in order to better understand how philosophy is communicated and packaged. Let's quickly sketch out the three main branches of philosophy that come down to us out of the Greek or Western tradition: metaphysics, epistemology, and axiology. So metaphysics is a branch of philosophy that has to do with what is reality. That's the inquiry. Is there a God? Do human beings have souls? Those are metaphysical questions. It's a term that Aristotle invented, meta meaning above or beyond physics. Physics is the phenomenal world of matter and energy, what we can perceive with our senses and think about with our minds. But Aristotle argues there's metaphysics. In other words, in your physics classes, in your science classes, you study the material world and you study light and motion and all of that stuff, molecules and atoms and energy. But where did all of that come from? What's behind that? What is that source? And so right away, your mind goes to the great religious traditions, God or gods, or that kind of metaphysical claim. Certainly, the claim that there is a God is a metaphysical claim. And the atheist counterpoint that there is no God is also a metaphysical claim. So metaphysics is that branch of philosophy that deals with questions of what is reality. We're going to be doing a lot of metaphysics in our study of Asian philosophy. Second branch is called epistemology. Episteme meaning to know or knowledge in Greek. Epistemology is theories of knowledge. And so this is an important branch of philosophy that's kind of connected to metaphysics, because when you make a metaphysical claim like there is a God, immediately there's another question. How do you know? By what standards are you claiming that opinion is a fact? So epistemology is that branch of philosophy that dives into that problem. Like, how do we establish that something is true as opposed to just a belief? So in classic philosophical circles, knowledge is defined as justified true belief. So it all starts as a belief. Like one could believe that the moon is made out of green cheese. Fine, you can believe whatever you want. You don't have to present evidence or anything. But if it's justified, that means there's evidence. And if it's true, that means the evidence is sufficient to prove that it is true to any other reasonable person. Then you have justified true belief, then you have knowledge. So, as you can already imagine, all kinds of challenges are going to rise up. But that's the job of epistemology, is to wade into that swamp and try to figure out, how do we tell the difference between some crazy conspiracy theory and something that's actually real? So I think you would agree that in our world today, epistemology is of urgent concern. And so metaphysics and epistemology are two of the big classical categories within Western philosophy. The third is axiology. Now, that might not be a familiar word to you. Maybe I could put it more simply as our values. And I'm talking about ethics, morality, right and wrong. What matters and what doesn't matter? What is the right thing to do, right? So in a word, ethics, I think most people would just get rid of the axiology word and just say metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics. And that's not bad. That's probably more user-friendly. I'm using the fancy word axiology because it really is a larger category that within which ethics exists, but also branches like aesthetics. What makes something beautiful? Isn't that a value judgment also? Why is this painting so beautiful and worth $1 billion? And this painting that you found at the swap meet is not so great and it's worth $1. Why do we evaluate some things as beautiful and other as not? And that's a whole discussion we're not even really taking up in this class. If you major in philosophy later, you can take classes in aesthetics. It's certainly a big concern in any study of art. But my point is that axiology has more going on in it than just ethical stuff. However, let's focus on the ethics, because that's the most important, isn't it? Right and wrong. And we're going to encounter in our study of Asian philosophy lots of positions on that question, what is right and what is not right. And as you can imagine, it's not all going to line up. There's different points of view. But let's look at how those three branches of Western philosophy, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, exist really in all philosophical inquiries, including Asian philosophy. But let's look at also how they're interconnected. Let me show you what I mean. Let's get out of the clouds here. Let's think of an example. What's the most vexing one of the most vexing ethical challenges in our society? How about abortion? Let's start there, right? Hot topic. Lots of good people on all sides of that question. And it's not just thumbs up, thumbs down. There's lots of nuance on the gradient scale within the question of when is it right, if ever, to terminate a pregnancy, under what conditions, and so on. There's lots of different positions, right? Our job here isn't to catalog all of them. So let's keep this simple. But let me ask it this way, what metaphysical problem or question is tucked up inside the ethical question, is abortion right or wrong? Is there a metaphysical position inside of an ethical position regarding abortion? And I think there is. And one way to put it would be, when does life begin? What is a human being? Is an egg coming out of the uterus and going down the fallopian tube every 28 days, is that egg a human being? No. Otherwise, we'd have a funeral every 28 days, every menstrual cycle. But when that egg is fertilized, when there's a sperm event, if I can put it scientifically, and 10,000 sperm are swimming around that egg and one gets in, it becomes fertilized, it becomes a zygote. Is that a human being? There are people who say, yes, that is a human being, protected by the U.S. Constitution, has the right to life. And that fertilized egg, that single cell, well, now two cells, because there's a cell inside, especially when it splits into 2 and into 4 and into 8 and et cetera, just multiplies, and some cells specialize and go off here and become bone, and other cells specialize and go over here and become brain or skin or a pancreas or whatever. And when that human being develops, at what point do they become a human being? current law in the United States, Roe v. Wade, talks about something about viability outside the womb. But that, because of neonatal care, keeps getting pushed back further and further and further. There's a heartbeat pretty quick. So good people disagree on when that potential human being, when that fetus becomes a human being. And I would argue that that's a metaphysical question. People take different positions on it, but you are, when you say that a zygote is a human being, that's a metaphysical position. When you say no, as some cultures do, a baby isn't fully human until it has taken a breath. Or in Navajo culture, a baby isn't fully human until they have learned how to speak. Wow. So different people drop the needle in different places as to when a fetus becomes a human being and is therefore their rights are equal to the rights of the mother. So again, the abortion question is like infinitely fascinating and rich and problematic, but it illustrates for us just how interconnected metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics are. If you take the ethical position that abortion is morally wrong in all cases, then you are taking the metaphysical position that a zygote is a human being, and you are claiming epistemologically that you know that that is true. And that's not just your opinion, right? That's some sort of fact. And if conversely, if you take the position that abortion may be problematic, but the rights of the mother take precedence over the rights of the fetus, that the mother is a citizen, is a human being whose liberty is protected also by the Constitution, that at the moment of conception, she doesn't become this incubator with no rights over her own body. If you don't have rights over your own body, what does liberty even mean? So people who are in favor of legal abortion argue, if you've got to preserve the liberty of the mother, that the right to terminate a pregnancy is between her and her God and her rabbi or her minister and her partner. And some people would say she doesn't even have to consult any of those people. It's her body, her choice. That is also a metaphysical position. That is not murder, that is not a full human being. It's going to be a human being, but it is not yet a human being equal in their claim to rights as the mother. So forgive me if I went on too long on this example, but I'm really caught by this, and this is relevant to our study of Asian philosophy. In Western philosophy, we're always very busy separating things out. Here's metaphysics, here's epistemology, here's ethics. But as you can see, as we get into a lived example, namely abortion, all three of those branches of philosophy, like three threads, weave into one rope. And you can't really do ethics without at the same time doing metaphysics and epistemology. So my goal here is just to get us used to these three terms, metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, so that we can start using them in the application of studying philosophy. We're going to be talking about Buddhist ethics and Hindu metaphysics and so on and so on. We're going to confront entirely, if you're rooted in the Western tradition, we're going to be confronting entirely bracingly different epistemologies, ways of knowing that aren't just rooted in logic and reason, but are rooted in a kind of interior knowing and experiential knowing and embodied knowing, accessed not through rational discourse, but through meditation and direct experience. We're going to confront devotional systems. And if you are Jewish or Christian or Muslim in the Western traditions, then you already know what I'm talking about. When you hit your knees and you are in prayer and you experience something religiously, that is a kind of epistemology too. Atheists wouldn't accept that. They just think you're tripping. But for people of faith, that is a legitimate epistemology, direct religious experience, mystical experience, etc. So all these things are going to continue to work together for us. One last point I'll make in this video. Eastern and Western philosophy. We're separating them. And that's kind of fake. It's kind of artificial because human beings are human beings and they philosophize in 1,000 different ways. Why drop such a crude East versus West binary into the discussion? Well, it's actually sort of useful as long as we're not too dogmatic or rigid about it. Let me sketch it this way, that in the West, especially with the coming dominance of Christianity, or just the Abrahamic faiths in general, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, you have God. And whether you're a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, you believe in the same God, the God of Abraham, outside of space and time, and the author of space and time, and the creator of us, and we are to have a relationship with that God, etc. And so in the West, religion and philosophy kind of parted ways. Remember, Plato and Aristotle lived 500 years before Jesus. And they're not religious philosophers. They value logic and reason. But along comes, out of the Jewish past, this prophetic tradition where men called prophets like Abraham and Moses and Elijah and all the rest, on through Jesus, on through Muhammad, 500 years after Jesus, these are prophets who give us scripture, who give us God's truth. They reveal to us God's truth. That's called revelation. So in Western religion, knowledge and wisdom don't come from human effort. They don't come from rational discourse. They come from God, spoken through prophets, embodied in teachers like Jesus, Muhammad, Moses, etc. Whereas in Western philosophy, they're going to stick to their guns. It's like, no, if you're going to make a truth claim, you have to prove it with evidence that can be logically supported with reason, not revelation. So you even hear the Apostle Paul in the New Testament kind of complaining about philosophy and warning against philosophy. Paul, if you're a Christian, you know who Paul is. He traveled around. He's a contemporary of Jesus. The two never met, but Paul's responsible really in many ways, I think, for putting Christianity on the map. He wrote half the titles in the New Testament, all those letters to the Romans and the Corinthians and so on, right? And Paul traveled a lot, and when he got to Athens, he said, I get big crowds in Athens, but no converts. There's skeptical people in Athens, but they love to get into these discussions. But Paul warned us against philosophy, saying, be cautious about philosophy because it can trick you into believing anything. Paul's a mystic. And Paul, like Augustine later in the Christian tradition, Paul believes that the Holy Spirit speaks to us inside, that the inner Christ knows things that the conceptual mind cannot know. That's a classic mystical claim that more rational philosophers don't want anything to do with. So there's a tension between religion and philosophy in the West, and they kind of parted ways. And if you're Roman Catholic, there are great figures, Augustine and later Thomas Aquinas, St. Thomas, who are going to work to try to bridge that, to bring faith and reason back together with varying degrees of success. But let me jump to the Asian traditions. Out of India and later in China, that divorce between faith and reason never happened. That schism between religion and philosophy never happened. So that when we dive into our study of Asian philosophy, which we're going to do very, very soon now, and start reading about India and the Vedas and the Upanishads and Hinduism and all of that, we're going to see that in the Indian tradition and all the rest of the Asian traditions, what we in the West call philosophy and religion never separated. They kind of live together. Logic, reason, science, prayer, meditation, devotion, religious ecstasy, mystical vision, transcendent knowledge. They all weave together. They coexist and they fortify each other. So that's one of the differences between Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy. Eastern philosophy's got a lot more religion woven all through it. they're much more comfortable with prayer and meditation and devotion, brushing right up against hard-headed scientific rational investigation. And that's something that in the West you just don't see. So that's one way to start off our studies, to kind of get philosophy figured out from a Western perspective, and then equip ourselves with some tools, understanding what metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics are and how they work together, and then thinking a little bit about the distinctions between East and West. But from here on out, the rest of our videos are going to be about Hinduism, and later Buddhism, and then after that Confucianism and Taoism. Lots of rich discovery and inquiry to come. So glad you're here with us in our study of Asian philosophy. See you on the other side.